I now recognize Mr. Lieu for his questions for 5 minutes.
I want to thank Chairman Nadler and Subcommittee Chair Bass for your excellent leadership on this outstanding legislation. We are here because Black Lives Matter. And most Republican officials have been unable to say those 3 words. The President has been unable to say it. The Attorney General hasn't said it. And the overwhelming majority of Republican senators and House members have not said it. Why does this matter? Because you can't fix the problem if you can't even identify the problem. This is not a problem of a few bad apples. This is systematic institutional racism against Black Americans. Our life is precious. Black lives are subjected to much higher risk of brutality from the police than white lives. That's what the data shows. We know, for example, that Black Americans are killed at a rate twice as high from police than white Americans. Our government murdered George Floyd and countless Black Americans. And it wasn't one rogue cop who put his knee on George Floyd's neck. There were an additional 2 police officers who had their knees on George Floyd's body, and then a 4th officer who stood as a lookout, and then a Minneapolis Police Department spokesperson who gave a completely misleading initial account of what happened. And then there were the officers and civilians at the department who knew about the 18 misconduct claims against Derek Chauvin and didn't take strong enough action. It takes a village to allow for the persistent, systematic murder of Black Americans by our government, and this has got to stop. The Justice and Policing Act takes a critical step to stopping the state-sanctioned police brutality against Black Americans. It has a lot of great provisions. First one I'd like to focus on is training. Now, is training going to stop bad cops from doing bad things? No. But it might help good cops from doing bad things. I note for the record that in terms of training hours, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, police recruits spend on average 840 hours in basic training and 500 hours in field training for a total of 1,340 hours. In California, to be a licensed cosmetologist requires 1,600 hours. So in other words, it takes more training hours to be a hairdresser than to be a police officer. Now, just as important as the number of hours is how we train our officers. I'm very pleased that this legislation requires training in racial bias, in racial profiling, and in procedural justice. My first question today is to Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, when you testified before this committee last September, you talked about procedural justice. Can you explain what procedural justice training is and why it's so important?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I can. The basic concept of procedural justice is the evidence that shows people comply with the law, not because they're afraid of the police or even going into custody. They comply with the law because they're giving a voice. They believe the law is fair and equitably applied, and that the process will be fair to them. We know this over the years when people get tickets and we survey them. How they're treated determines their view about that process more than whether or not they got the ticket. So this idea of procedural justice is a way to obtain compliance, how to get people to themselves, but to comply. And it should be trained so that officers know how to gain compliance, how to give people a voice, how to recognize how they treat people has a greater impact on how they respond to that authority than anything else.
Thank you very much. My second question is to Ms. Ifill. Recently, Attorney General Bill Barr stated that he didn't think there was systematic racism in law enforcement systems. Do you agree with him that this is just an issue of a few rogue cops rather than the systems we currently have in place?
Not only do I disagree with him, but if Attorney General Barr would consult the reports issued in his own department in pattern and practice investigations in over 24 jurisdictions throughout the country, he would learn that systemic racism actually exists in police departments around the country that has been fully investigated and found by the Department of Justice, who've sued those jurisdictions and put them under consent decree. The bad apple theory of policing reform is a failure. It looks only at individual officers instead of the system in which they operate. And if we want to change culture, if we want to change relationships, then you have to change the rules that govern that system. There's no change that happened in this country, especially culture change, that happened because of midnight basketball or that happened because we all got in a room and ate together. We didn't end racial discrimination and segregation in schools by all getting together and having a meeting. It actually required law to make it happen. We didn't end the barring of women from being hired in certain professions by having a conference. It required the law. And now we have found a systemic problem that has been with us for decades that requires law to actually change the context in which policing happens in this country and to give us a chance to make and to look at public safety more broadly than we've done in the past and to make police officers accountable within that system of public safety.
Thank you very much. The time of the gentleman has expired.